London, 1851. The persistent rain had not deterred the early visitors to the great exhibition, nor had it dampened the enthusiasm of the gossips who huddled beneath their umbrellas outside the Crystal Palace, exchanging the latest scandal as eagerly as merchants traded goods inside. "Have you heard? Lord Isaiah Sutherland has finally decided to marry," whispered Mrs. Pembroke to her companion. "And not to any of the eligible young ladies presented this season, mind you. He's chosen the widow Edwards. Jane Edwards." Lady Farley's eyebrows shot up. "The seamstress?" "The very same. A woman of no consequence who had the good fortune to marry a merchant, only to lose him at sea before he could squander what little fortune he'd amassed." Mrs. Pembroke's voice dropped lower. "They say Lord Sutherland's estates are mortgaged to the hilt. It's clear as day, he's marrying her for her money. And she's marrying him for his title, no doubt," added Lady Farley with a sniff. "How very convenient for them both." The rain intensified, forcing the women to seek shelter, but their words had already taken flight, carried through London's drawing rooms like leaves in an autumn breeze. Lord Isaiah Sutherland stood at the window of his study, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the rain-soaked gardens of his London townhouse. At 35, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair just beginning to grey at the temples. The years had carved distinguished lines into his face, giving him the appearance of a man who had seen much of life, though perhaps enjoyed little of it. Behind him, his solicitor, Mr. Finch, continued to enumerate the extent of Isaiah's financial ruin in a tone that suggested he was discussing nothing more consequential than the weather. "The Northumberland estate must be sold," Mr. Finch stated flatly. "And the London property will follow unless immediate action is taken." Isaiah closed his eyes briefly. "My father's debts were that extensive?" "I'm afraid so, my lord." The late Earl's fondness for the gaming tables was matched only by his unfortunate lack of skill. Finch shuffled his papers. "However, there is a solution that would satisfy the creditors and allow you to maintain your position in society." "Mrs. Edwards," Isaiah said, turning to face the solicitor. "Indeed. The widow's fortune is modest by aristocratic standards, but substantial enough to clear your most pressing debts. Her husband was prudent enough to secure her future before his untimely death." Isaiah rubbed his forehead. "And she has agreed to this arrangement?" "She understands the benefits, my lord. You offer a title, security, and respectability. In exchange for her financial resources, she will become a countess, quite a leap for a merchant's widow who has been reduced to taking in fine sewing to supplement her income." "You make it sound like a business transaction, Finch." "Is it not, my lord? Marriage among the nobility has rarely been otherwise." Isaiah sighed. "When am I to meet this paragon of practicality? I've taken the liberty of arranging tea tomorrow. Mrs. Edwards will call at 3. After Finch departed, Isaiah remained in his study, contemplating the portrait of his father that hung above the fireplace. The late Earl gazed down with the same haughty expression he'd worn in life, offering no wisdom from beyond the grave. "Well, father," Isaiah muttered, "your passion for cards has dictated my future once again. I hope you find it amusing, wherever you are." Jane Edwards sat primly in Lord Sutherland's drawing-room, her dove-grey dress chosen carefully to convey both respectability and restraint. At 28, she was no longer in the first flush of youth, but her beauty had matured like fine wine, more complex and satisfying than the simple sweetness of a débutante. Her light brown hair was arranged in a simple yet elegant style, and though her clothing was not of the latest fashion, its quality and impeccable tailoring spoke of her skill with a needle. She had spent the previous evening alternately questioning her sanity and reminding herself of the practical benefits of the arrangement. When Lord Sutherland entered, Jane rose and curtsied, taking the measure of her future husband in a single glance. He was handsome, she acknowledged dispassionately, but there was a hardness to his jaw and a wariness in his eyes that suggested he kept the world at arm's length. "Mrs. Edwards," he said, bowing. "Thank you for coming." "My lord." Her voice was soft but clear, with the refined accent she had cultivated since marrying Mr. Edwards 6 years earlier. Before that, she had been plain Jane Ellis, daughter of a country vicar with nothing to her name but an education and determination. They sat, and a maid brought tea. Isaiah waited until they were alone before speaking again. "I presume Mr. Finch has explained the situation to you?" "He has, my lord." Jane poured tea with steady hands. "You require funds to settle your father's debts and maintain your estates. I possess those funds but lack the protection and position a titled husband would provide. It is a practical solution for us both." "You're very direct, Mrs. Edwards." "I see little point in pretense between us, my lord. This is not a love match." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps. "Indeed not. Though I hope we might at least become friends. Friendship would be pleasant, but unnecessary for our purposes." Jane handed him his cup. "I have only two conditions for our arrangement." Isaiah raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware we were negotiating terms." "Every marriage is a negotiation, my lord, whether acknowledged or not." Jane met his gaze steadily. "First, I wish to maintain some independence. A quarterly allowance that I may spend as I choose, without accounting to you." "Reasonable." "And your second condition?" Jane hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I would like a child, my lord. An heir for you, of course, but also a family for myself." Isaiah's cup paused halfway to his lips. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That would require certain intimacies between us." A faint blush colored Jane's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I am not ignorant of marriage's physical aspects, my lord. I was a wife before." "Very well." He set his cup down with a decisive click. "I have conditions of my own. You will comport yourself as befits a countess. No hint of scandal must touch our arrangement. And you will not interfere with my affairs or activities. I have no interest in controlling your life, Lord Sutherland, only in securing my own. Then we understand each other." Isaiah nodded briskly. "The banns will be read starting this Sunday. We shall be married in 1 month's time." Jane rose to leave, gathering her shawl and reticule. At the door, she paused and turned back to him. "My lord, might I ask one question?" "You may." "Are you certain you wish to proceed?" Marriage is binding, even one of convenience. For the first time, his expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Edwards, we are both practical people trapped by circumstances. I believe we can make this work to our mutual benefit." She nodded once and departed, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and the impression of a woman who had learned to navigate life's disappointments with grace. The wedding was a quiet affair, attended only by a handful of Isaiah's relatives who couldn't decently avoid it, and Jane's former employer, Lady Harrington, who had taken an interest in the widow's welfare. The society papers noted the event with thinly veiled speculation about the Earl's sudden interest in a merchant's widow, but neither bride nor groom paid any mind to the gossip. Their first evening as husband and wife was spent in stilted conversation over dinner at Sutherland House. Jane wore a new gown of deep blue silk, her one extravagance for the occasion, while Isaiah remained in the formal attire from the ceremony, his cravat loosened only slightly as the hours wore on. "Your rooms have been prepared according to your specifications," Isaiah said as they finished their port. "Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper, will show you up when you're ready." Jane nodded, folding her napkin precisely. "Thank you, my lord. I hope you'll find I've kept my requests modest." "I've no doubt. You've shown remarkable restraint thus far." He hesitated, then added, "I should inform you that I'll be departing for the Northumberland estate tomorrow. There are matters requiring my attention." "So soon?" Jane couldn't quite keep the surprise from her voice. "Business doesn't wait for personal convenience, I'm afraid. I should return within a fortnight." She studied him for a moment, sensing this sudden trip was less about business and more about escaping the awkwardness of their new situation. "I understand. Perhaps the time apart will allow us both to adjust to our changed circumstances." "My thoughts exactly." Isaiah rose and moved to her chair, helping her stand with perfect courtesy. "Good night, Lady Sutherland." The title still felt foreign to Jane's ears. Good night, my lord. He took her hand and, after a moment's hesitation, brushed his lips across her knuckles in the briefest of kisses. It was a gesture of formality rather than affection, yet Jane felt an unexpected warmth spread through her fingers and up her arm. She withdrew her hand quickly, attributing the sensation to nerves and fatigue. As she followed Mrs. Collins up the grand staircase to her new chambers, Jane reminded herself that this was exactly what she had wanted, a practical arrangement that would secure her future. It was foolish to feel disappointed by her husband's imminent departure or to read anything into a perfunctory kiss. Yet as she prepared for bed in her elegant new rooms, alone, Jane couldn't help but wonder if she had traded one form of loneliness for another. 2 weeks stretched into a month, and still Isaiah remained in Northumberland. Jane settled into her role as Countess of Sutherland with quiet determination, reviewing household accounts, meeting with staff, and making subtle improvements to the running of Sutherland House. She joined Lady Harrington for tea several times, attended a musical evening at the home of Isaiah's cousin, and began the careful process of establishing herself in society. The reactions to her new position ranged from curiosity to disdain, but Jane faced them all with the same composed dignity that had carried her through widowhood and financial uncertainty. Beneath her placid exterior, however, lurked a growing frustration with her absent husband. When Isaiah finally returned to London, he found his wife in the conservatory, trimming roses with precise snips of a small pair of gardening shears. The afternoon sun caught the gold and red highlights in her hair, and for a moment, he simply stood watching her, struck by the picture she made among the flowers. "I see you've made yourself at home," he said at last. Jane started slightly, then turned to face him. "Welcome back, my lord. I trust your business was concluded successfully." "Well enough." He stepped further into the humid warmth of the glass-enclosed garden. "I received your letters. Your suggestions regarding the household economy were quite insightful." "Thank you." Jane set aside her shears and wiped her hands on a small cloth. "I hope you didn't mind my taking the initiative." Mrs. Collins seemed at a loss without clear direction. "Not at all. You are the mistress of this house now." Isaiah moved closer, noting the light freckles across her nose that hadn't been visible before. "You look well. London society seems to agree with you." Jane gave him a measured smile. "I've been received with tolerable civility, though I suspect your prolonged absence has been the subject of some speculation." "No doubt." He hesitated, then added, "I apologize for extending my stay without proper notice." "You owe me no explanations, my lord. We agreed you would maintain your independence." "Independence, yes. But not discourtesy." Isaiah frowned slightly. "I hope you haven't felt abandoned." Jane turned back to her roses, her profile revealing nothing of her thoughts. "I've been quite busy learning my new role. Your cousin Lady Spencer has been particularly helpful in introducing me to the right people." "Margaret always did have a soft spot for lost causes," Isaiah remarked dryly. "Is that what I am, my lord? A lost cause?" Jane's voice held a new edge. Isaiah realized his misstep immediately. "Not at all. I merely meant that a merchant's widow elevated beyond her station must be a project for the charitably inclined." Jane snipped a rose with perhaps more force than necessary. "I assure you, I'm quite capable of finding my own way." "I never doubted it." Isaiah moved to stand beside her, close enough to catch the scent of lavender that seemed to follow her. "In fact, I've been rather impressed by what you've accomplished in my absence. The household runs more efficiently, expenses have been reduced without sacrificing quality, and you've managed to charm even my most disapproving relatives." Jane's hand stilled. "Have I?" "Lord Pemberton mentioned that you held your own admirably when Lady Ainsley tried to put you in your place at the Harrington tea." A small smile played at Jane's lips. "Lady Ainsley was under the impression that I didn't know the difference between Sevres and ordinary porcelain. I may have mentioned that her prized collection contained several obvious reproductions." Isaiah laughed, a rich, genuine sound that caught them both by surprise. "I would have paid good money to see her face." It was rather satisfying, Jane admitted, her own smile widening. For a moment, they stood together in companionable silence, the tension between them easing. Then Jane turned to face him fully, her expression growing serious. "My lord, Isaiah, I understand that ours is a marriage of convenience, but if we're to present a united front to society, we must at least appear to be a true husband and wife. Your extended absence so soon after our wedding has raised eyebrows." Isaiah studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. "What would you suggest?" "That we attend Lord and Lady Carmichael's ball together next week. It's one of the season's most important events, and our joint appearance would quell the most persistent rumors." "Very well," he agreed. "Though I warn you, I'm a reluctant dancer at best." "One quadrille for appearance's sake will suffice," Jane assured him. "Beyond that, you may retreat to the card room with the other husbands while I navigate the treacherous waters of the matron's corner." The corner of Isaiah's mouth quirked upward. "You make it sound like a military campaign." "Is it not?" Jane raised an eyebrow. "Society has its own battles and victories, my lord. I intend to win mine." Looking at her, chin lifted, eyes bright with challenge, Isaiah felt something shift inside him, a stirring of admiration and something else he couldn't quite name. This woman he had married for financial salvation was proving to be far more interesting than he had anticipated. "Then we shall face the battlefield together, Lady Sutherland," he said with a small bow. "I look forward to watching you conquer." The Carmichael Ball was everything society events were meant to be: glittering, crowded, and ripe with potential for both triumph and disaster. Jane and Isaiah arrived fashionably late, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they made their entrance. Jane had invested in a new gown for the occasion, a creation of deep emerald silk that complemented her fair complexion and brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes. The modiste had raised her eyebrows at Jane's specific requirements: elegant but not ostentatious, fashionable but not at the cutting edge, but the result was exactly what Jane had wanted, a dress that allowed her to blend with the aristocratic crowd while still maintaining her own sense of style. Isaiah, resplendent in formal evening attire, found himself unexpectedly proud as he escorted his wife into the ballroom. The curious glances and whispered comments that followed their progress were met with his most forbidding expression, a silent warning that gossip about Lady Sutherland would not be tolerated. "Lady Spencer is signaling to us," Jane murmured, nodding toward Isaiah's cousin, who stood with a small group near the refreshment table. "Shall we rescue her from what appears to be a most tedious conversation with the Windermeres?" Isaiah suggested. Jane's lips twitched. "How very gallant of you, my lord." They made their way across the crowded floor, exchanging greetings and brief pleasantries as they went. Jane handled each introduction with poised grace, neither too humble nor too proud, striking exactly the right note of dignified friendliness. "Isaiah!" "And the lovely Lady Sutherland," Margaret Spencer exclaimed as they approached. "You've saved me from Mr. Windermere's detailed account of his new breeding program for hunting dogs." A grave injustice averted, Isaiah replied with a small smile. "Though I fear we've merely postponed the inevitable for some other unfortunate soul." As the group laughed, Jane felt a moment of genuine warmth. Perhaps this evening wouldn't be the ordeal she had anticipated. That hope was short-lived. During their obligatory quadrille, Jane became acutely aware of the scrutiny they were under. Every move, every exchange between her and Isaiah was observed and analyzed. She maintained her smile, but her fingers tightened slightly on his hand during a turn. "Is something amiss?" Isaiah asked quietly as they came together in the dance. "Lady Ainsley and her circle are watching us like hawks studying field mice," Jane replied through her smile. "I believe they're hoping for some sign of discord they can amplify into scandal." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "Ignore them. You're a countess now. They can't touch you." "On the contrary, my lord. My elevation makes me a more tempting target." The dance separated them briefly, and when they rejoined, Isaiah surprised her by drawing her slightly closer than the dance required. "Then let us disappoint them thoroughly," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. The unexpected intimacy sent a shiver down Jane's spine. Before she could respond, the music ended, and Isaiah led her from the floor with perfect correctness, though his hand at the small of her back seemed to burn through the silk of her gown. As the evening progressed, Jane found herself increasingly aware of her husband's presence, even when they were separated by the width of the ballroom. There was something different about him tonight, a protective vigilance that manifested in the way his eye sought her out, the manner in which he returned to her side at regular intervals, the subtle possessiveness of his hand guiding her through the crowd. It was during a moment of relative quiet, as they stood watching the dancers, that Lady Ainsley made her move. She approached with two younger women, both dressed in the very latest Paris fashions. "Lord Sutherland," she cooed, ignoring Jane completely. "How delightful to see you return to society. We feared you might have retreated permanently to the country after your hasty nuptials." Isaiah inclined his head with cool politeness. "Lady Ainsley. Nothing so dramatic, I assure you. Merely estate business." "Of course." The older woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though it must be said, your absence left your new bride to navigate her unexpected position without guidance. Quite cruel, some might say." Jane felt Isaiah tense beside her. Before he could reply, perhaps with the cutting retort she could see forming, she placed her hand lightly on his arm. "I found my husband's confidence in my abilities quite flattering, actually," Jane said sweetly. "And his family has been most welcoming. Why, Lady Spencer has been as helpful as a sister." Lady Ainsley's lips thinned. "How fortunate. Though I wonder if you find your new responsibilities overwhelming at times? Such a leap from managing a seamstress's workroom to overseeing a countess's household." The insult was clear, but Jane merely smiled. "On the contrary. Precision, attention to detail, and the ability to handle delicate materials with care are skills that translate remarkably well to managing both a household and social relationships. Don't you agree, my lord?" Isaiah looked down at his wife, genuine admiration warming his eyes. "Completely. My wife's deft touch has improved every aspect of Sutherland House." Lady Ainsley, clearly displeased that her barb had failed to draw blood, made one final attempt. "Well, I suppose even the most unconventional matches can find their footing eventually. Though I must say, the speed of your courtship left many wondering if there might be a pressing reason for such haste." Jane felt her cheeks warm at the implication, but before she could respond, Isaiah stepped slightly forward, his expression hardening. "I would advise caution, Lady Ainsley," he said quietly. "Speculation about my wife's character reflects poorly not on her, but on those who engage in such gossip." The older woman blanched at his tone. "I merely was just leaving, I believe," Isaiah finished for her. "Good evening, Lady Ainsley." Dismissed so firmly, she had no choice but to retreat, her companions trailing behind like chastened puppies. When they were alone again, Jane released a shaky breath. "Thank you." Isaiah turned to her, his expression softening. "No need. You were handling her admirably. I simply grew tired of her venom. Still, it was nice to have an ally." Jane met his gaze, suddenly aware of how closely they were standing. Something shifted in Isaiah's eyes as he looked down at her, a darkening, a focusing of attention that made Jane's pulse quicken. "We may have married for convenience, Jane, but we are husband and wife. I'll not have anyone disrespect you." The use of her given name, rare in their interactions, felt intimate in the crowded ballroom. Jane swallowed, trying to regain her composure. "Perhaps we should take some air?" The terrace, an excellent suggestion. Isaiah offered his arm, and Jane placed her hand upon it, acutely conscious of the solid warmth beneath the fine fabric of his evening coat. The terrace was blessedly cool and relatively empty, with only a few couples seeking respite from the heat and noise of the ballroom. Isaiah guided Jane to a quiet corner where climbing roses provided a semblance of privacy. "Better?" he asked as she took a deep breath of the night air. "Much." Jane looked up at the stars, visible despite London's haze. "I hadn't realized how exhausting it would be, maintaining a perfect countenance for hours on end." "You've done beautifully," Isaiah said, his voice lower than usual. "Every inch the Countess." Jane turned to him, surprised by the compliment. "You sound almost proud." "I am." Isaiah stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight shadow of beard beginning to darken his jaw. "You've exceeded every expectation, Jane." "Have I?" she whispered, suddenly unable to look away from his face. "Yes." His hand rose to her cheek, the touch so light she might have imagined it. "I begin to think I may have gained far more from our arrangement than financial salvation." Jane's breath caught in her throat. This was dangerous territory, far from the safe, practical boundaries they had established. Yet she couldn't bring herself to step back or remind him of their agreement. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly into his touch, her eyes dropping to his mouth. "Isaiah, Lord and Lady Sutherland." The cheerful voice of Lord Pemberton shattered the moment. "There you are. My wife was just wondering if you might join our supper party." Isaiah's hand fell away from Jane's face, but his eyes held hers for a heartbeat longer before he turned to address his friend. "Of course. Lead the way." As they followed Lord Pemberton back into the ballroom, Isaiah's hand came to rest at the small of Jane's back once more. The gesture was proper, correct, and yet Jane felt it with an intensity that left her both confused and yearning for something she hadn't known she wanted. The carriage ride home passed in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken thoughts. Jane sat across from Isaiah, watching the play of shadows across his face as they passed street lamps and the occasional lit window. He seemed lost in contemplation, his gaze directed out the window, though she doubted he was seeing the darkened streets. When they arrived at Sutherland House, Isaiah helped her from the carriage with impeccable manners, his touch formal once more. They entered the house together, handed their outer garments to the waiting butler, and paused at the foot of the grand staircase. "Well," Jane said, suddenly unsure of herself, "it was a successful evening, I think." "Indeed." Isaiah studied her face in the soft glow of the entry hall lamps. "You handled Lady Ainsley masterfully." "With your assistance," Jane reminded him. She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for that. For standing with me. As I said, we are husband and wife." His voice had taken on that deeper quality again, the one that seemed to resonate through her very bones. Jane nodded, unable to find words for the confusion of emotion swirling within her. They had married for mutual benefit, not affection. The strange tension between them tonight, the way her skin had tingled at his touch, the dark intensity of his gaze on the terrace, none of it had been part of their agreement. "Good night, then, my lord," she said finally, turning toward the stairs. "Isaiah," he corrected her softly. "When we are alone, at least, I would hear my name from your lips." Jane paused, one hand on the banister. "Isaiah," she repeated, the name feeling strangely intimate. "Good night." "Good night, Jane." She climbed the stairs slowly, aware of his eyes following her progress. Only when she reached the landing did she hear him move, his footsteps retreating toward his study. In her rooms, as her maid helped her undress, Jane tried to make sense of the evening. She had married Isaiah Sutherland for security and position, he had married her for her modest fortune. It was a practical arrangement between two adults with clear expectations and boundaries. So why, as she lay in her bed hours later, could she still feel the phantom touch of his fingers against her cheek? Why did the memory of his eyes, darkening as he looked at her on the terrace, send a shiver of anticipation through her body? Jane turned onto her side, pulling the covers more tightly around her. This was dangerous thinking. Developing genuine feelings for her husband of convenience would only lead to disappointment. Whatever had passed between them tonight was likely nothing more than the natural result of playing their part so convincingly. Tomorrow, she decided, they would return to their original understanding. Polite, respectful, distant. It was safer that way. Isaiah found sleep equally elusive that night. In his study, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, he stared into the dying fire and tried to reconcile the evening's events with his carefully constructed plans. Jane Edwards, no, Jane Sutherland now, was not at all what he had expected. When Finch had first proposed the match, Isaiah had envisioned a meek, grateful woman who would fade into the background of his life, her only contribution the financial salvation she brought to his estates. Instead, he had found himself married to a woman of quiet strength and surprising wit, whose dignity in the face of society's cruelty had awakened his admiration. And tonight, standing close to her on that terrace, the scent of roses mingling with her lavender perfume, he had wanted nothing more than to kiss her, not from duty or obligation, but from genuine desire. It was an unwelcome complication. Isaiah had spent years building walls around himself after watching his father's passion destroy their family security. The late Earl had loved deeply but unwisely, gambling away their fortune in increasingly desperate attempts to recoup his losses after Isaiah's mother died. Isaiah had vowed never to let emotion cloud his judgment or threaten what remained of the Sutherland legacy. Yet here he was, unable to banish thoughts of his wife's soft skin beneath his fingertips, the way her eyes had darkened when he'd stepped closer, the slight parting of her lips that had nearly undone his resolve. Isaiah drained his brandy in one swallow, welcoming the burn. Tomorrow, he decided, he would remember their arrangement and maintain the proper distance. Jane deserved that much, the honesty of their original agreement, not the confusion of unexpected attraction. With that resolution firmly in mind, he extinguished the lamps and headed upstairs to his solitary bed. The following weeks brought a tentative new rhythm to their marriage. Isaiah remained in London rather than fleeing to Northumberland, and they settled into a routine of shared breakfasts and occasional dinners, depending on their social obligations. They attended events together when propriety demanded it, and gradually, the whispers about their hasty marriage faded as society found newer scandals to dissect. Through it all, they maintained a careful distance, polite, cordial, even friendly at times, but always with an invisible barrier between them that neither seemed willing to cross after that night at the Carmichael ball. Jane threw herself into her role as Countess of Sutherland with renewed determination, visiting charities, managing the household, and slowly winning over even the most skeptical members of society with her quiet dignity and surprising knowledge of art, literature, and music, the result of her vicar father's emphasis on education. Isaiah found himself increasingly drawn to his wife's company, seeking her opinions on estate matters and lingering over breakfast to share the latest political news or debate some point of literature. He told himself it was merely the pleasure of intelligent conversation, nothing more. But there were moments, a brush of hands as they reached for the same book, eyes meeting across a crowded room, the accidental intimacy of finding themselves alone in the conservatory, when the carefully maintained distance between them seemed to shrink to nothing, only to expand again as one or both of them retreated to safer ground. It was during a rare evening at home together, nearly 2 months after their wedding, that the fragile equilibrium they had established finally began to shift. A summer storm had rolled in unexpectedly, forcing them to abandon plans to attend the theatre. Instead, they found themselves in the library after dinner, Jane embroidering by the fire while Isaiah read correspondence at his desk. The comfortable silence was broken only by the patter of rain against the windows and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Jane looked up from her work to find Isaiah watching her, his letters forgotten. "Have I sprouted a second head, my lord?" she asked lightly, setting aside her embroidery hoop. A small smile played at his lips. "Isaiah, remember? And no, your head count remains perfectly normal. I was merely thinking about how different this is from what I expected when we married." He rose from his desk and came to sit in the chair opposite hers. "I thought we would lead largely separate lives, crossing paths only when necessary for appearances." Jane smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "And now? Now I find I prefer your company to most others." Isaiah's admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than he had perhaps intended. I feel the same," Jane confessed, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping to her hands. "Though I'm not sure what that means for our arrangement." Isaiah leaned forward slightly. "Must it change anything? Can we not simply enjoy this unexpected friendship?" "Friendship?" The word should have reassured Jane, yet it left her oddly disappointed. "Of course. Friendship is a fine basis for any marriage, even one of convenience." A particularly loud crack of thunder shook the windows, making Jane start. The lamps flickered, then steadied again. "Are you afraid of storms?" Isaiah asked, noting her reaction. Not precisely afraid. Jane smiled ruefully. But I've never been entirely comfortable with them. My husband, that is, Mr. Edwards, was lost in a storm at sea. I suppose it left an impression. Isaiah's expression softened. I'm sorry. I hadn't considered that you might have loved him deeply. Jane was silent for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Richard was kind to me. He offered security when my father died and left me with nothing. Our marriage was companionable. Not unlike ours, then, Isaiah observed. In some ways. Jane hesitated, then added quietly, though Richard and I shared a bed from the beginning. Ours was a true marriage in all respects. The air between them seemed to thicken at her words. Isaiah's eyes darkened, and Jane felt her cheeks warm at her own boldness. I see, Isaiah said, his voice lower than before. And you find our current arrangement lacking in that regard. Jane's heart pounded against her ribs. They were venturing into dangerous territory now, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. You'll recall that one of my conditions was the hope for a child. That would require certain adjustments to our current living arrangements. Isaiah stood abruptly and moved to the fireplace, resting one arm against the mantel as he stared into the flames. I haven't forgotten. I simply thought, that is, I assumed you would tell me when you wished to pursue that aspect of our agreement. And if that time were now. The words escaped before Jane could reconsider, hanging in the air between them like the electric charge before lightning strikes. Isaiah turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. Is that what you want, Jane? Jane rose slowly from her chair, her embroidery forgotten. She began, then faltered. How could she explain that what had begun as a practical desire for a child had somehow transformed into something else entirely? That she found herself lying awake at night, remembering the brief touch of his hand against her cheek, wondering what it would be like to feel those hands elsewhere on her body. The truth, please, Isaiah said, his voice gentle but insistent. Jane took a deep breath. The truth is that I find myself drawn to you. Not merely as the father of the child I hope for, but as a man. My husband. Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. I want you, Isaiah. In my bed. In my life. Far more than I should, given the nature of our arrangement. The silence that followed her confession seemed endless. Isaiah stood perfectly still, his face half in shadow, while Jane's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Then, in 3 long strides, he crossed the space between them, his hands coming up to cradle her face with exquisite gentleness. Jane, he breathed, his eyes searching hers. My Jane. And then he was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a hunger that matched her own. Jane's hands clutched at his shoulders, then slid up to tangle in his hair as she opened to him, meeting his passion with equal fervor. This was nothing like the chaste, dutiful kisses she had shared with Richard. This was fire and need and something deeper, something that made her feel both powerless and extraordinarily strong. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since that night on the terrace, he admitted. Perhaps even before. Why didn't you? Jane asked, her fingers still playing with the short hairs at the nape of his neck. I thought it would complicate matters. That it would be unfair to you, given our agreement. His thumbs traced gentle circles on her cheeks. I didn't want you to feel obligated. Jane laughed softly. And here I was, thinking much the same thing. That you had married me for my fortune, not my person, and that any advances would be unwelcome. Nothing could be further from the truth. Isaiah kissed her again, more gently this time, a slow exploration rather than a desperate claiming. I may have married you for convenience, Jane Sutherland, but I find myself wanting you for entirely inconvenient reasons now. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the library's warm confines, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one of long-denied desire and newly acknowledged feelings. Then take me to bed, husband, Jane whispered against his lips. And let us discover just how inconvenient this marriage of convenience might become. Isaiah's eyes darkened at her words. Without further discussion, he swept her into his arms and carried her from the library, up the grand staircase, and toward his chambers. Jane's arms twined around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder as she breathed in his scent, sandalwood and paper and something uniquely him. In his bedroom, lit only by a single lamp and the occasional flash of lightning, Isaiah set her gently on her feet. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both suddenly shy despite their earlier boldness. "I should warn you," Jane said softly, "that while I was married before, I'm not, that is, Richard was rather traditional in his expectations." Understanding dawned in Isaiah's eyes. "Your previous experiences were perhaps not entirely satisfying." Jane's cheeks flushed. "They were dutiful. On both our parts." Isaiah's expression softened as he reached for her, his hand spanning her waist. "Then allow me to show you that duty and pleasure need not be separate concerns." His kiss this time was different, slower, more deliberate, designed to coax rather than demand. Jane melted into it, her initial nervousness dissolving under his expert attention. When his hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress, she offered no resistance, only a soft sigh against his mouth. With patient care, Isaiah undressed her, each newly revealed inch of skin receiving its share of reverent touches and gentle kisses. Jane trembled beneath his ministrations, her own hands fumbling with his cravat, waistcoat, and shirt, eager to feel his skin against hers. When at last they stood before each other, unclothed and vulnerable in the flickering light, Isaiah took a moment simply to look at her, his gaze like a physical caress. "You are beautiful, Jane," he murmured, leading her to the bed. "Every part of you." What followed was a revelation to Jane, an education in the difference between obligation and desire, between perfunctory touch and genuine passion. Isaiah's hands and mouth seemed to know instinctively where and how she needed to be touched, drawing responses from her body that she had never imagined possible. When at last he joined his body with hers, the sense of completion was so overwhelming that tears sprang to her eyes. "Have I hurt you?" Isaiah asked immediately, his body going still above hers. "No," Jane whispered, her hands pulling him closer. "No, it's just... I never knew it could be like this." Relief and something deeper flickered in his eyes. "Nor I," he admitted, beginning to move again. "Not until you." Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the rumpled sheets, the storm outside finally subsiding, Jane traced idle patterns on Isaiah's chest, marveling at the sense of contentment that suffused her entire being. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Isaiah's arms tightened around her. "Now you stay. Here. With me. Every night." Jane propped herself up on one elbow to look at his face. "And our arrangement? Our marriage of convenience?" Isaiah reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely tender. "I think, my love, that we may need to renegotiate those terms. For I find there is nothing convenient about how I feel for you now." "And how is that?" Jane held her breath, scarcely daring to hope. Isaiah smiled up at her, all his usual reserve gone, replaced by an openness that made him look years younger. "I believe I am falling in love with you, Jane Sutherland. Quite inconveniently, irrevocably, and completely." Joy bloomed in Jane's chest, bright and warm as summer sunshine. "How fortunate, then, that I find myself in precisely the same inconvenient situation." Their laughter mingled in the darkness, followed by kisses that soon rekindled the passion they had only just discovered. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal a sky full of stars, witnessing the transformation of a practical arrangement into something far more precious, a marriage of true hearts, joined not by necessity but by love that had awakened despite all careful plans to the contrary. 1 year later, the christening of Lady Eleanor Margaret Sutherland, heir to the Sutherland estates and fortune, was attended by all the finest families in London. The infant, barely 2 months old but already showing signs of her mother's quiet determination and her father's observant nature, slept peacefully through most of the ceremony, waking only to fix the vicar with a most disapproving stare as the cold water touched her forehead. She has your expression exactly, Jane whispered to Isaiah as they stood receiving congratulations afterward. That look that makes grown men quake in their boots. Isaiah smiled down at his wife, his eyes warm with affection. And your stubbornness. The nurse says she refuses to sleep unless she has the last word in those mysterious conversations she holds with herself. A woman who knows her own mind, Jane agreed, gazing lovingly at their daughter, now nestled in the arms of Lady Spencer, who had appointed herself honorary aunt with great enthusiasm. The past year had brought changes neither could have imagined when they first entered their marriage of convenience. Isaiah's careful management and Jane's practical economies had begun to restore the Sutherland fortunes, allowing them to keep both the London property and the Northumberland estate. More importantly, the walls Isaiah had built around his heart had crumbled entirely under Jane's gentle siege, revealing a man capable of deep feeling and unexpected tenderness. For her part, Jane had blossomed in her role as Countess of Sutherland, winning over society with her grace and intelligence. Even Lady Ainsley now acknowledged her with grudging respect, especially after Jane had organized a charity bazaar that raised unprecedented funds for the orphanage Lady Ainsley patronized. "Shall we escape for a moment?" Isaiah murmured in her ear as the reception continued around them. "The conservatory should be quiet." Jane nodded, and they slipped away from the gathering, leaving Eleanor in the capable hands of her adoring aunt. In the humid warmth of the glass-enclosed garden, surrounded by the roses Jane had carefully tended, Isaiah pulled his wife into his arms. "Happy?" he asked, searching her face. "Deliriously so," Jane confirmed, rising on tiptoe to brush her lips against his. "Though I still wonder sometimes if all this is a dream, the child we both wanted, the love I never expected to find." Isaiah's arms tightened around her. "If it is a dream, then we are dreaming it together. And I, for one, have no wish to wake." "Nor I," Jane agreed, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "Though I do think we might consider giving Eleanor a brother or sister in a year or two. For practical reasons, of course. An heir and a spare, as they say." Isaiah laughed, the sound vibrating through her. "Always so practical, my love. Though I suspect your motives might involve more pleasure than practicality this time." Jane smiled up at him, her eyes bright with mischief. "Perhaps. Would that be so very inconvenient?" "On the contrary," Isaiah murmured, lowering his mouth to hers. "I find it most convenient indeed." Their kiss, tender and full of promise, sealed a bargain far different from the one they had made a year before, not a marriage of convenience, but a union of hearts, strengthened by the unexpected joy they had found in each other's arms.